Hello and welcome to the 2020 Writers' Trust Awards, Career Honors Edition. In lieu of in-person celebrations, this year the Writers' Trust is going digital to award more than $300,000 to Canadian writers. In this series of interviews, prize jurors from each of the Writers' Trust Career Awards will be chatting with recipients about their lives as writers, their work, and what's next for each of them. My name is Kaie Kellough, and this year I served on the Latner Writers' Trust Poetry Prize jury, alongside poets Marilyn Dumont and Susan Glickman. I am proud to present this unique award, which celebrates one poet's entire body of work. As much as this $25,000 prize is in recognition of past work, it is equally symbolic of our anticipation for work to come. Finally, I would like to thank the Latner Family Foundation for both creating and funding this prize, and for their commitment to advancing and celebrating remarkable voices in Canadian poetry. This year's winner has animated larger-than-life figures such as Geronimo, Grey Owl, and Norval Morrisseau, while at the same time engaging profoundly with the daily life of Indigenous people. His language is lucid and understated. The spirit of metaphor infuses his work with a larger understanding of the relationship of individuals to the time and place they inhabit. His most recent collection demonstrates a poetic struggle with the English language and the colonial instruments which came with it. With each successive book, this poet has demonstrated increasing range, expertise, grace, consolidating his claim to that place. It is my great pleasure to announce the winner of the 2020 Latner Writers' Trust Poetry Prize, Armand Garnet Ruffo. He was born and raised in Chapleau, Northern Ontario, and draws on his Ojibwe heritage for his work. He is the author of 5 books of poetry, including Grey Owl, The Mystery of Archibald, The Thunderbird Poems, and Treaty Number, for which he was a Governor General's Literary Award finalist. He is also the author of the creative biography, Norval Morrisseau, Man Changing into Thunderbird, which was also a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Awards, and the feature film, A Wendigo Tale, winner of Best Picture at the 35th American Indian Film Festival. Ruffo is the recipient of a Life Membership Award from the League of Canadian Poets and the inaugural Mayor's Arts Award from the City of Kingston. Currently a professor in English at Queen's University, he lives in Kingston, and Armand is here with us today. Welcome, Armand. It's very nice to be here talking with you.
Likewise, Anine. Hello. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to receive this award.
So, as one of the jury members for the 2020 Latner Poetry Prize, one of the requirements for us was that we read works from different periods of an artist's writing life. So, of your works, we read Opening in the Sky, The Thunderbird Poems, and Treaty Number. And it was remarkable to see the developing range of concerns in your work and to see the style mature. And this is where I would like to begin. In your early book, Opening in the Sky, which was published in 1994, the voice is lyric and is very much socially engaged. At that time, who were you reading and how were you thinking about your work? And I'm curious because your work has changed so much over the past 25 years.
Well, for Opening in the Sky, a lot of those poems were actually written well before the book actually was assembled. Some of them were written during early 90s, but a lot of them were written in the 80s. I had studied, I guess I have to go back and say I had taken a general degree after leaving Northern Ontario. I traveled to Toronto and went to York for a couple of years. And while I was there, I encountered what was his name now? Mandel. He was a poet himself, and he had a course on Canadian poets. I was not in English department, but I took his course, and he introduced the class to all the main poets, Canadian poets of the time, the ones who were the big names like Leonard Cohen and Al Purdy and of course Michael Ondaatje and Margaret Atwood. So I was reading those people at that time. So that would have been I'm a child of the 70s, so that would have been the late 70s. And then I left, and then I moved to Ottawa to work for Native organizations, and that's when I started seeing some Indigenous writing. Not a lot, because we're talking now 79 into 1980. And then at that time I started engaging with the local scene. The Tree Reading Series, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's still running.
Yeah, it's ongoing.
Yeah, it's ongoing, and it started in 1980, I believe. So I had arrived there, and I started attending these readings and seeing a younger generation, but also, that generation as well. There were readings by Ondaatje, I remember, at Ottawa U that I attended. Margaret Atwood. So I was reading, the general Canadian literature, some newer writers, very, very few, well, at that time, literally no Indigenous writers, were reading that I knew of. Then around, so that's the 80s. And, I started reading also broadly myself because, I became interested in books, and I read, for example, I really got into Pablo Neruda for a while. What was his name? Hans Magnus Enzensberger. I remember he wrote a book called The Sinking of the Titanic that really caught my interest. So I was reading very widely. Paul, what was his name? Paul Durkin, the poet, the British poet. So some international writers. I was going to these local readings, and so that's where a lot of those poems. And then because I come from Northern Ontario, I was exploring my own Indigenous Ojibwe heritage. So a lot of those poems were coming out of that period, and with those influences. And it was only until I got, like in '89, then I got a scholarship to the Banff Center. And that's when I really, started writing seriously, under the guidance of Adele Wiseman, who was running the program. And that's when I started reading more Indigenous writers. I would just go to the library, and they had quite a, good library of writing there. And then everything really changed when I got hired. So I think it was '89. I ended up in Oklahoma, because there was this conference called Returning the Gift, and it brought Indigenous poets and writers from across North America to Oklahoma. And suddenly, I'm introduced to all these, Joy Harjo, Simon Ortiz, Leslie Marmon Silko, a whole range of, and Scott Mamaday. Everything opens up for me, and at that time I start working then for the Algonquin Center in British Columbia, and then I start meeting Jeanette Armstrong, Lee Maracle, all these Canadian Indigenous writers who are also working. So there's not a lot going on in the country at that time in terms of poetry and writing that's getting published mainstream, but I'm finding it by then. So that book comes out of then, that early work, that, the Canadian kind of stuff I'm reading, the general, literature by the, like I said, the mainstream poets. And then it's starting to get influenced by the Indigenous writers I'm reading.
So that leads me to another question, which is, I'm always interested in what people experienced when they entered the publishing landscape. So what kind of experience did you have when you first started publishing? What kind of experience did you have getting your work published? Beyond that, I guess, how was it received and engaged with by reviewers?
Yeah, that's a very good question because, so like I said, I started publishing a few things in the 80s, and there's not much. There aren't a lot of places that are actually publishing Indigenous writing. I mean, one of the very first places that I got published was in a journal called Northward Journal, published by John Flood out of was Penumbra Press, I believe. And so that was really, great for me. Suddenly I see my work in print, and that's like, I don't know, early 80s. And then I believe Arc Poetry published me. But it's few and far between at that period. It's only until things really change late 80s because of Thompson Highway getting so much success with his plays and then opening the door for other playwrights. And I'm also writing plays at that time as well. So there's a whole kind of scene going on in Toronto. I'm not that active, writing plays because I'm not part of that. I'm not living in Toronto, basically. I mean, it was really Native Earth that's really running, Native Earth Productions really running with these plays and producing them. But Thompson's success has huge ripples for everyone. Suddenly, publishers are taking notice, and I think around 90 as well, Tom King has moved to Canada from the States, and I think he's teaching at Lethbridge, and he publishes a collection of an anthology, sort of anthology of Indigenous fiction, and that occurs because of, I believe, because of Thompson's success. Publishers are starting to get interest, and so early 90s. Then there's more chances of publication. I get published in the New Quarterly, for example, the Windsor Review. Those, as far as reviews, I don't know if I ever got a review. I don't think people knew what to make of it, because it was different. It wasn't celebrating, the pioneer spirit. The 70s was such a period of national, the 1967 Expo, then the writing of the 70s, Atwood with Survival and all that stuff. Well, that's still the huge wave that's passing through Canadian literature. And, you have a group of writers who aren't doing that. So, and I also mentioned while I was in Ottawa, because we weren't getting published, we started literally publishing ourselves. I was with a group. We formed a small group called Wino. A bit of irony there.
Yeah,
it was Indigenous writing group, and we published one of the writers in the group named Ann Aiko. She was working in the government, and she financed the publication of a little publication that we put out. I'm working I'm attending university at Ottawa U, but I'm also working for Native organizations at the time. And, the newspapers are these Indigenous journals. We're starting to publish poets and story writing. And so, yeah, that kind of thing is going on. And also, I should mention, Datus Press gets established in the 80s, and it publishes in 89, I believe. It publishes a collection called Seventh Generation Contemporary Native Writing. Okay. So, again, Native people are taking, control of our own writing and publishing ourselves because, again, there's not a lot. I mean, it's changing, but there's not a lot of opportunity. And then by 2000, again, everything's, everything's wide open. I mean, Oxford publishes its anthology of Canadian Native literature in English. I think that's in 1990. So, So everything opens wide up.
I love that discussion of how Native writers had to take publishing into their own hands and create and represent their own work and develop their own literary community. I love that exercise of that. I love that agency and that creating of a distinct space for Native writing.
Yeah, that was important because, like I said, well, actually the Oxford Anthology came out in 92. Up until that time, it was really under the wire. I mean, there were a few people making an effort to publish Indigenous writing. I believe, what was her name? There was an anthology that came out a few years, like it had actually come out earlier. But, it was Marilyn Bowering. She published a collection called Many Voices as early as 1977. And there were a few Indigenous writers in it, but it was a real mix of different kinds of, different voices, non-Indigenous and Indigenous. But like I say, it was few and far between. And it's only, with the success of Thompson, that other publishers, non-Indigenous publishers really start taking notice. But for poetry, it's still, under the wire, and it's early 90s. Things really start to change. For example, Marilyn Dumont herself publishes Really Good Brown Girl. Louise Half publishes Bare Bones and Feathers. And then in fiction, Richard Wagamese publishes Keeper and Me in 94. It all starts really happening in the early 90s. And then, then Greg Schofield comes along. So we're kind of like the second wave after that earlier first wave of Indigenous writing of the 60s and 70s that was mostly like Maria Campbell's Half Breed in 73. Mostly a memoir and kind of oral stories.
You've also published not just poetry, but you wrote a biography of Norval Morrisseau. But in fact, you wrote two works that engage with the life and painting of Norval Morrisseau. So one poetry and one prose. And what were I'm curious, what were some of the things that one form allowed you to do that another form didn't?
Yeah, well, prose, as you know, in your own work, the poem really was working with the word, and prose is the sentence. And although, obviously some poetry, my poetry included, works with the sentence, but I wanted, with the prose, I really wanted to tell his story, a narrative. We call it kind of like the Bajamo, and kind of in Ojibwe, it's a long narrative, an everyday story, his life in general. And I was also infusing it with another kind of story, which we call Odisselcan, which is kind of these mythic stories, because these sacred stories, because his life, in a sense, was mythic, as his art was, because he didn't differentiate between the mythic world and the everyday world. So I wanted to kind of blend those two kinds of storytelling traditions together. So that was the prose. And then in the poetry, what happened there is that while I was writing the prose, I would start writing these poems, and the poems for me were kind of these elliptical kind of moments, if I can use that word, because for me poetry has this kind of compression, and you don't have to spell everything out, and it's kind of holding this energy, I like to say. And so the poems then were kind of these moments where I could really kind of compress an event and compress time and not be tied to, you know, this happened and then that happened, you know, kind of this linear event. Because poetry can kind of move all through time. It just, you know, that's the wonderful thing about poetry. It's not tied to the linear time. So that's why I started writing. I don't know why I started writing the poems, but I found out I could do this with the poems. And what happened, interestingly enough, is I intended, when the prose book came out, there are about 8 or, I don't know, half a dozen or so poems in there, scattered throughout, and I thought that's all I would do in terms of the poetry, but the poems kept coming. You know, I was wrapping up the book, and the poems just started coming, kept coming and coming. And so what happened was, I think I wrote 53 or so, something like this, and I wanted an even number, but I couldn't do it. And suddenly just stopped. I was so frustrated. I'd go for walks and think, oh, I could get a couple more poems, make it even 55, whatever. I couldn't do it. So I just start with the end. They had just come and they had left, and that's how poetry, I think, works.
Well, yeah. I'm actually reading the biography now. We read the book of poetry for the prize, and then I just found Morisot's life to be so extraordinary and such achievement and such sort of so many devastating episodes as well that it was really, and he seemed to be such a larger than life magnetic character with this incredible talent.
Yeah, I mean, he was you know, like I said, when I say in the introduction, when I walked in, he said, what took you so long?
Yeah.
So, you know, he had this way of just kind of taking one in, you know, taking you into his experience, and that's why I tried in the prose book to break from what we might call traditional kind of storytelling and realism, you know, because the paintings are mythic, and that's, like I say, that's how he saw his life.
Mm. I'd like to go back to poetry for one final question. Your most recent book of poetry is Treaty Number, and it features several poems that function almost as pillars of the work, in which treaties are presented with, they kind of punctuate the work at intervals, in which treaties are presented with the language turned backward. And as a reader, my experience of those poems was, you know, it was pretty visceral and immediate. And, you know, the things that came to mind as I was reading through the poems was perhaps duplicity, incomprehensibility, encoded meanings, even noise. And would you be able to tell me about how you arrived at that formal decision to turn the text backward?
Well, you're right on in noting that, you know, there's all those elements, duplicity, incomprehensibility, coded meanings, because, you know, I was reading the treaties at the time, and, you know, I'm very interested in history, and, you know, I'm constantly reading about history, reading about Indigenous encounters with the colonizer right at you know, in both in the 18th century, 19th century, and it occurred to me that these treaties were really intended to, you know, just to rob Indigenous peoples of the land and get them off the land and get them, you know, put us on reserves and forget about us. You know, out of sight, out of mind. And how did that occur? Well, you know, it wasn't by accident. You know, it wasn't. We know that now. I mean, anybody who knows a little bit about Canadian history understands that. And so when I saw these treaties, and I was just trying to read them, you know, I consider myself fairly educated. I could not understand them. I'm trying to, you know, and so I'm thinking, well, what would the people at the time, you know, some of the Indigenous people certainly read English, but if I can't understand them, they wouldn't understand them. And then there's all those people who didn't understand English, who, you know, and then had translators. There's a poem in the book I think The Poet. It's about a translator who just really wants to get out of there, and he's trying to translate the stuff, but they won't even tell him what it means. So using that, I thought, well, first I thought I would just blank, you know, I've seen, you know, blank out the words, but I thought, no, that's, you know, they saw the words, so the words weren't just blacked out. They actually saw the words, but what did they see? And what did they comprehend? Well, you know, it was made to be opaque. It was made to obfuscate and to render, you know, those signing it, disempower them, to render them powerless. So that's what I was trying to get at there. And so I'm really happy that you saw that and read that into the piece.
Oh yeah, I mean it's incredible. It's almost like the language is being turned against you, because it's as you're trying to read it, it's sort of making sense, but then it's turning against or away from you. It's really powerful.
For sure, and language can be a weapon. Of course, we know that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's exactly how it was used. And so I mean, you know, we honor the treaties because that's, in some cases, that's all we have left. But there's no doubt the treaties were used against us.
Well, yes, thank you for that answer. And overall, thank you for Armand for producing a body of work that continues to challenge our relationships with our history, with ourselves, with this land, and with one another. All of us are very grateful for your thinking and your artistry. We're thrilled to see you receive this prize, and we are very hopeful that your future will bring sustained creativity. And for any listeners, you can listen and watch the other interviews with this year's Writers' Trust Career Prize winners on SoundCloud at Writers' Trust, or on YouTube at Writers' Trust of Canada. On YouTube, you can also watch the Writers' Trust Awards, Emerging Writers Edition, and Books of the Year Edition, celebrating the best in Canadian literature. We thank you for joining us today, and thank you and congratulations, Armand.
Oh, Meg Rich, thank you very much. I really enjoyed our chat, Kaie. Take care.